in a few days. The recording is in progress. Okay, so I'm very excited tonight to talk with Josh Cowen, who is a new friend. I was quite amazed recently. It seems like just a couple of months ago, I discovered that Josh was I can't help thinking of a rodeo example, because I grew up in Houston, and you'd go to the rodeo, and the main event was when they had the guy on the bull, and they'd open the gate, and suddenly the guy would come out on this bull, and if he could last a certain number of minutes or seconds, he would win a prize. And I had not been aware of Josh's work, but suddenly I see on Twitter this graph that says that kids who leave public school to go to a voucher school lose more ground academically than they would have lost during the pandemic. And I was like, whoa. I mean, like, I have seen a lot of voucher studies, almost all of them are negative, but I know that the school choice lobby has a bunch of studies where they say disregard the negative results. We have lots of positive results. And so it seems to be like a stalemate, because when they go into a state to advocate for vouchers, you only hear the positive results. So I met Josh virtually, and this is our first real conversation. So Josh, welcome. I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight. And I might add that his virtual background is a one-room schoolhouse in Michigan. And I will add that it is virtual indeed.
It is.
Josh, I'd like you to begin by talking about yourself, how you got into the field you're in, and what you've been doing over these past 20 years or so, that brought you to the moment when you came bouncing out of the gate on that school choice bull.
Yeah, well, thanks, and it's good to see everybody. And I know a lot fewer of you than Diane and Carol do, but I've recognized many of you from our online community that has been so hospitable to me recently, and I appreciate that. And it's good to be here. I guess I'll just be real brief. It's sort of in that background way. I have been involved in these in the sort of school choice evaluation world, really for almost all of my professional and adult life. I'm in my mid-40s now, and when I was a young graduate student at Georgetown in 2001 and 2, I was really actually assigned to be a research assistant for a young assistant professor at that time named Pat Wolf, who's now at the University of Arkansas, but at the time was himself fresh out of grad school at Georgetown as an assistant professor there, and was leading the DC site for what eventually became the first kind of multi-city evaluation of what was a privately funded voucher program led by Paul Peterson at Harvard, and the program on education policy and governance. That was a set of studies that got a lot of attention at that time. Peterson was and is, I think, a fairly prominent conservative policy scholar of sorts. And then I did what graduate students do. They go off and they continue some of that work that they started in grad school, and they work on other things. And one of the other things I worked on was another voucher evaluation coming out of Milwaukee in 2005. And that was a 5-year project. That's up 5 years is an eternity in program evaluation work. And I've been a part of a couple of those now, and you measure them in terms of like other things going on in your life, childbirths and marriage and things like that occupy that. But what I like to tell folks was that my view of the voucher research, I've sort of been, for better or worse, again, since I was 22 years old in 2000, I was sort of present at the creation in some sense, and there were some research by that same team, Peterson and fellows, Jay Green now at Heritage, but when all those guys were young grad students in the late 90s, that's when this kind of stuff in the voucher world started coming up and taking on the flavor and structure of unbiased evaluation. I have some comments on that flavor later maybe, but these came out in very sort of serious or scholarly outlets like Brookings. Matt Brookings today published a book that came out of this three-city study that Peterson led, and that started to set up what became a couple of decades of motivation and data that conservative choice proponents started to use to push these things nationally. And what I didn't know at the time, and I don't think any of us knew, was the small positive effects that the Peterson team showed in 2002 in these very small pilot-sized programs. And by that, I mean 1,500 kids or so, like not a lot of kids in big urban environments, but that was about as good as it was ever going to get in terms of voucher impacts on outcomes. Because even in the 2005 five-year evaluation that we did, and that was on behalf of the Wisconsin State Legislature, although that was funded by conservative foundations like the Bradley Foundation, which I've talked a lot about on publicly recently. Anyway, even that five-year evaluation, that group, we didn't see any difference in test scores between public and private school kids. And that ended an era of 2000, 2010 or so with what I would call very gentle to no, sort of, at least when talking about impacts on test scores, not much was going on. And then 2012, 2013 came, and we saw these really enormous, overwhelmingly large impacts, negative impacts on kids' academic outcomes coming out of the state of Louisiana when their voucher program was expanded to a statewide program. And in the kind of very serious, first term, early second term, the Obama administration type Dem program evaluation type people, like the community that I was sort of around and trained in, aside from this Peterson group, everybody was very surprised and thought of this is almost unprecedented. It's really difficult to find test scores that move as large in any program, positive or negative. It's really hard to move academic outcomes the way the Louisiana voucher program appeared to move test scores downward. But everybody said, okay, well, that was a fluke. It was Louisiana. We're never going to replicate post-hurricane reconstruction of school districts. And then David Figlio, an economist who's now the provost at Rochester, released a report for the Fordham Institute, which is a conservative think tank, as many of you know. And they found even larger negative effects in the Ohio statewide voucher program. And then right around the same time, a guy named Mark Behrens, who's a professor at Notre Dame, school choice expert there, released a report from Indiana that showed not as big as Ohio and Louisiana, but as large as what we were later going to see in the pandemic results on academics. So that was 3 straight states of relatively independent. I mean, those folks had all written in different areas, but not sort of what's thought of as sort of like in the tank heritage far right scholars. I mean, these were people who had created some respectable sort of careers for themselves. And we were seeing these massive negative impacts, and people were trying to figure out what was going on. And then IES released a report from DC led by a guy named Mark Donarski that showed very similar negative impacts in DC. So one on top of the other, Louisiana, and then Ohio, and then Indiana, and then DC. And those 4 studies from multi-year evaluations from 2013 to 2020 they're really the last word, because states have really clamped down on voucher evaluations since. Not surprisingly, we don't know what's going on in Arizona with their test scores. You can look at NAEP and things like that, but nothing on this magnitude. And just to sort of wrap up, I'll stop there. But that's sort of a 20-year history of sort of the trend in voucher test scores, at least from sort of a relatively neutral. I mean, no one's totally neutral, right? But not far right studies is what I'm trying to say. And I like most folks in my sort of with my background and in the groups of folks that I've kind of came up through the professional ranks and was tenured and made full professor and all these folks, we all sort of knew that these things were really bad. I think I thought in my naivete, I think I thought that was enough to kill these programs, at least enough to stop pretending that they worked. And I went off and did other things. From 2016 to 2020, I was building a research practice partnership, a research center that I helped run for 4 years before stepping down. Fundraising and working with state agencies and districts, and really not spending a lot of time thinking about vouchers, because again, it's very difficult to overstate how big and how unprecedented these negative results are. Like, you don't see this in normal education policy research, and you don't see it in four different places that are really unrelated, right? I mean, that it seems very clear that these programs don't work, and there are some structural reasons for that. But lo and behold, 2016 happened, and Betsy DeVos became education secretary, and that breathed a lot of new life into these programs. I have a collection of headline articles on screenshots and things of DeVos when she was secretary, having to confront these results as these were being rolled out. And when she was a public official, she couldn't quite dismiss them the same way that she can now or could before. And so she would say things like, well, it wasn't well implemented, or we have some different thoughts about that. But I guess just by wrapping up, where I went from sort of knowing this to being very public about it was, I'm based in Michigan, and we had a voucher program that was proposed in late 2021 that was vetoed by our governor in November of 2021. And immediately after she vetoed it, the DeVos group pivoted it into a ballot initiative. And we have a quirk in our state law that you can make law through the legislature without the executive signing it into law if you do it through the signature process. And so DeVos dumped what eventually became $7.9 million into this initiative. Was launched last February, almost a year ago. And in March, 10 months ago, I kind of looked around and I said, why are we still having this conversation? Like, we know how terrible these things are. And Heritage and the Goldwater Institute out of Arizona, working with the Mackinac Institute, their counterparts in Michigan, had started to pump out a bunch of pro-voucher stuff, claiming that these things helped kids and helped academics. And I've said this publicly, but at least the folks, I find it horrific, but at least the folks who are saying we want to move our kids to voucher programs because of values or woke or CRT or LGBTQ or something like that, there's an honesty to that. It's horrific, it's discriminatory, and it's bigoted, but it's at least telling the truth in a way that's saying that this is for kids and helping kids learn and creating a child-sized as opposed to one-size-fits-all education. That's where I kind of got involved. So I happened to be fortunate enough to be fairly well connected in the media and political community in Lansing, and started to just sort of talk to people and say, this is wrong, and it's not we know better. And I wrote a couple of public pieces in the state newspapers there. And as these things sometimes do, after writing those for state outlets, I was asked to write some for national outlets. And then I wrote a piece for the Heckinger Report in July, kind of walking through everything I just talked about. And then that one thing led to another, and started reading more and about what was going on and connecting with many of you. And I think the other push for me was, I mentioned the Bradley Foundation earlier. The Bradley Foundation is a right-wing think tank based out of Wisconsin. And I had been reading about Bradley's work, some fantastic investigatory reporting from folks like Jane Mayer, the New Yorker, and Ann Nelson, the New Republic. I've been writing about Bradley for a couple of years and their role, not just part of, but being the key, I think Jane Mayer's words were the extraordinary force, that was her phrase, not mine, behind election denial funding. And I thought back to the time that I was on that 5-year evaluation as the lead sort of data analyst for that program that was for and on behalf of and with the authority of the Wisconsin state legislature, and Bradley funded all of that. And that's where I started, and they've spent $40 or $50 million at this point. We all know about Betsy DeVos, and I can talk at length about her, but these other groups like Bradley and the Kochs to some extent are just as much a part of this. And that's where it sort of got urgent for me, and I think that's what kicked me from just being a little irritated as a researcher that we had never seen anything like the negative effects that vouchers have caused, to thinking of it more in terms of, okay, we're all trained in graduate school and then as historians that there's a link between democracy and public education, and there's some real truth to that. But there's no longer a place for metaphors anymore, I don't think, in this kind of work and in this conversation. The folks who are working to privatize American schools are the same people, literally, and it's the same money that are working to make it harder to vote again, who are working to undermine confidence in election results that don't go their way, and so on and so forth. And so that's what's led me to this conversation today.
Well, thank you, Josh. As I was listening to you, it brought up so many memories, because back in the day, I'm talking now in the 1990s, I was conservative, and I had been involved in various Bradley projects. And I remember at the point where the Bradley Foundation decided to launch a voucher program in Milwaukee, or rather it was Howard Fuller and Polly Williams. And these were two Black leaders who said the public schools weren't working. We want vouchers. Polly Williams subsequently said it was a terrible mistake, and she regretted having been part of that. Howard Fuller, on the other hand, went on to get millions of dollars of funding from the Walton Foundation and all of the usual right-wing sources to create something called BAEO, Black Alliance for Educational Options, which, having received millions of dollars, eventually went out of business. But the Bradley Foundation, at the point where they started the voucher program in Milwaukee, initially the courts tried to stop it, and then it was appealed. And while it was appealed, the Bradley Foundation, I won't say personally because it's a foundation, not a person, but the Bradley Foundation kept the voucher program alive and spent millions of dollars to keep keep this going while it reached the Supreme Court eventually, and the Supreme Court said it was okay. And that was followed then by the Cleveland decision, where vouchers were okay in Cleveland because of the Milwaukee precedent. So I was following all of this and part of the conversation, and I knew Paul Peterson very well. And Paul is an interesting guy. He's very, very smart, and he runs this program at Harvard, which you referred to, the program on educational policy and governance at the Kennedy School. And it's interesting because I was on a panel with Paul in 1983, to go all the way back, where everyone on the panel said, oh, we were reflecting like a nation at risk and saying American education's in terrible trouble. Paul Peterson was our staff director, and he wrote a dissenting report from the board. And he said, American education is not failing. It's not in terrible trouble. It's doing just fine, thank you. But then he went on to become very strongly pro-choice, pro-voucher. And I've been through many, many meetings with Paul where I'd say that he is, I can't imagine a set of circumstances in which he would say vouchers don't work, because he continued to advocate them and continues to. And my only exchange with Patrick Wolf, who you mentioned, was that I knew that he was the designated evaluator of Milwaukee. He then went on to become the independent evaluator chosen by a Republican Congress to evaluate vouchers in the District of Columbia. And I thought he was independent because he kept being referred to as the independent evaluator. But then he did another Milwaukee evaluation. And at the point where I was reading his evaluation, he wrote an article in one of the Midwest papers. It wasn't in Wisconsin. It might have been in Minnesota. And he said, the problem with our state is we don't have vouchers. And I said, well, wait a minute, isn't he supposed to be the independent evaluator? Why is he writing opinion pieces on behalf of choice? So I read one of his evaluations, not the first one, but there was the second one, I believe, of Milwaukee. And what I noticed was that there was some dramatically huge attrition rate, and it was over 50%. It may have been even 60 or 65%. And I wrote about that on my blog, and Patrick Wolf wrote, and he said, I made a mistake. It's not 65 or 70 or 75%. It's actually only 45%. Well, I still think 45% is a very big number. I would have been shocked to discover 45%, but his initial guess, which he withdrew, was that it was a majority of the kids who were withdrawing from the, and the reason I mention this is because he said that the test scores were no different, but if the kids who stayed in the voucher program were likelier to graduate from high school, but they had to stay in high school to 12th grade to graduate, and close to half, if not more, didn't reach 12th grade. But he didn't think that was important. Then when I looked at his DC evaluation, I tried to find the attrition number. I couldn't find the attrition number. Subsequently, I spoke to the guy, Mark Donarski, who did the next DC evaluation, which was quite negative. And I said, what was the evaluation number? And he said, what was the attrition rate? And he wasn't quite sure what the attrition rate was either. But it seems to me that if you're evaluating a program and saying it succeeded because of the high school graduation rate, you have to say how many kids started and how many of them actually graduated. And not just say, well, they had this spectacular graduation rate, but half the kids dropped out before 12th grade.
Yeah, and I've been pushing a lot of that. You could make an academic profession argument that the thing that got me tenure was 3 or 4 years of research on kids who leave voucher programs. And that was just a thing. That's how you, for those of you who are not in the academic world, this is one of those things. You have to find your thing. And in mine, it was paying attention to kids who left voucher programs. And that began in Milwaukee. I think it was actually about 42% of kids stayed for 4 years for high schoolers. But the thing that's all of that period of time.
Join it again, I think, or join audio so they can actually hear you.
Oops.
Otherwise, you're just basically spectating it like a TV show or something.
What? Wait, I'm not sure. All of that period of time, that late that graduation rate, and I was part of that as well. The pivot to other outcomes, first graduation rates, and then things that are even looser than graduation rates, like satisfaction measures. That I don't mean to downplay parent satisfaction with schools, but just from a measure standpoint, all of that, what I call goalpost shifting, started around 2010, 2011, 2012, when these test scores out of Louisiana started to look, when I remember the first sort of report working paper that got tossed around the review community that I was a part of. And I'd been asked to give some public comments on it at some point 2 or 3 years before it was released publicly. That's when a lot of the right started moving, again, these goalposts, and that picked up in earnest after the next state's terrible test score results appeared. It's a hard conversation in 2023 for me to talk strictly about academic impact, simply because we all have our reservations about the use of testing and things like that. But my view of it is, and I think this is probably one of the contributions I've made to the conversation, is, whether we like it or not, test scores are still the coin of the realm in a lot of ways. They're tied to federal money. The federal government doesn't allow states to opt out of them necessarily. So as long as we're going to be talking about it, and as long as voucher advocates are talking about public schools in the language of failure, and they're using test scores to point to that word failure, that's where I'm going to engage on the test score conversation. I sort of made that decision about 10 or 11 months ago that I wasn't going to, I'll let others who are more well-versed in that conversation take that cudgel. And what I'll stick with is, as long as people are saying public schools fail, I'm going to be talking about the voucher failure in terms of test scores. But as I've gone around sort of virtually, mostly virtually around the country in some of these states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Idaho, Iowa now today, Missouri, the other piece of data that I think has really caught some fire, and I expected it I expected the massive negative impact. Communicating that to a wider audience was going to be important. And I think that, as Diane mentioned, I think it has been very important. But even more important has been the other number that we've learned from these voucher studies until data were shut down. And that's that when voucher programs are expanded, created or expanded in states that we have the data for, the vast majority of voucher participants are already in private school well before the taxpayers started to pick up the dime. And it's an uncanny similar number. It doesn't matter the state or the regs or the rules guiding these voucher programs. It's about 8 in 10 kids who use voucher programs were in private school before the voucher program existed. And we know that because of the advent of big administrative data sets that states prepare for compliance purposes with the federal government, stuff that I've spent my whole career working with and building research centers around these massive population level data sets. I mean, the data we've worked with in Michigan and in Wisconsin on the voucher program, we're talking about administrative data on every single child in the public school system. And that's how the state knows that voucher recipients are 8 in 10 of them when they did not have ever a record in public education before, and the tax dollars follow that child. I think that statistic, that 8 out of 10 kids, and the states we know really well that this statistic exists are in Arizona just recently, Wisconsin, and then in New Hampshire. Three very different states, right? And different size voucher programs. But 8 and 10, that seems to be the magic number. Missouri, I guess the Missouri, my understanding is that they just reported out similar numbers just yesterday or the day before, and it was about 7 out of 10. So very close. We're already in private school well before a voucher. I think that speaks to people's intuitive or innate sense of fairness. I think it also gives a direct lie. It shows that phrase education freedom to be a lie and a package. It's not about providing opportunities for kids to leave failing schools. It's about giving a tax break to families that are already doing something. And that it's not actually, it shouldn't be shocking, right? It's shocking because the right has been so successful packaging this as a freedom issue. But name another interest group in Washington on the right or the left. I mean, there are a handful of, public interest oriented groups, but most groups that have a footprint in the state capital or the national capital work on behalf of a constituency, and it's their job to get public funding or to get tax breaks or whatever. I mean, it would be very abnormal for an organization with the pockets in the organization that the pro-voucher people do, for them to be simply advocating, as if it was some altruistic thing for children. That's not what's going on. It's a good chunk of this is just good old-fashioned looking to get tax breaks the way any other lobby does. The other piece of this, and I can talk about it if folks have questions, there's a mechanical reason that number 75 to 80% of voucher users come from private schools, not public. That can be true and still be a massive threat to funding public schools. I can talk about that if people are interested in. But the other mechanical reason it's important is that it's the reason that the cost estimates provided by DeVos-oriented think tanks or Heritage, Goldwater Institute, Mackinac, the Ed Choice type groups, it's the reason that the cost estimates for these programs always come in well below what the actual cost ends up being, because they're making strong assumptions about just shifting of resources, when in fact what's actually being done is creating new budgetary obligations If you know anything about state politics, state policy, or the tax code, when there are massive new budgetary obligations, the school aid fund in each state is usually the thing that gets rated. And that's not just on vouchers. It happens for lots of other pet projects on the right. But that it's that reason, it's that these are tax breaks and direct expenditures on behalf of private school tuition that didn't exist before. And that's why these projects all come in way above cost. In Arizona, famously, I mean, this is a massive number, but the Goldwater Institute was running around with a number of something like 35 million in the first year alone as a new cost to taxpayers in Arizona. It's already at 300 million, and the fiscal year is not even over. And that's why, because all of these kids are coming from private schools on the taxpayer dime now, instead of some smaller shift to resources.
Now, in Florida, as I understand it, the voucher program there is costing $1 billion a year. And the kids who get vouchers don't take state tests. So is there any way of knowing what the outcomes are?
No, and there's a reason for that. I mean, all of these people, the voucher research community, whether you're a sort of a right-wing hack like at the Goldwater Institute or one of these places, or whether you're trying to be, I said before we joined, I'm here at Brookings. I'm a board member of this National School Choice Research Center funded by the U.S. Department of Ed. It's a fairly small community in some sense, or community is maybe too generous a word. There's not, we all know each other. We've all known each other for years and years and years. Everybody sees the same information. Everybody could tell you about that Louisiana study and that Ohio study and that DC study and that Indiana study. And some of those folks really have influence on state policy through another organization many of you are familiar with, and that's ALEC. I don't even know what that acronym stands for at the moment, but
American Legislative Exchange Council.
And they're working with Bradley and with Heritage on the voter denial stuff. But ALEC also writes the legislation that the states import, and then they get a sponsor in a state legislature. Governor Reynolds, Iowa introduced something new today. They have the same folks writing this, and everybody knows that test scores make vouchers look really terrible at this point. So what they're doing is they're just removing any testing requirement. They're also stopping. It's been really difficult to get information, even like what I just said, how many kids are. I've asked some of our Florida allies to comment on the percentages of kids in using Florida vouchers who spent time in public schools. And some of these folks have been working with Florida data for years and years and can't get that number because it's very hard to get without strong FOIA. And you really need journalists to be digging at this stuff too. I know I don't have the training to get into a FOIA war with a state agency. And this is all by design. It's not even, you don't have to believe in black helicopters and deep state theories to just understand that this is information that's all being clamped down. And they've had some success removing requirements for testing. Like I said, all those studies that I mentioned all came with testing requirements. And the idea was, as long as public school kids are having to test, publicly funded private school kids are going to have to test too. When Governor Evers, Wisconsin Governor Evers, before he became governor, he was the state superintendent of schools, and that position in Wisconsin, unlike in a lot of states, including my own, it's a fairly influential position in Wisconsin. Was able to put some fairly good governance structures around the voucher program there. It couldn't get rid of the voucher program, but at least put some safeguards in. And one of the safeguards that was put in place was these ongoing periodic evaluations. Even DC, you mentioned, Diane, there's now a third round of federally required, congressionally required evaluation of the DC voucher program. Pat Wolf ran the first one, Mark Donarski ran the second, and now there's someone else, a team based out of North Carolina State, linked to the Peterson Group, that's running the third. I'm on the research advisory board of that third one too, with Jeff Hennig, who some of you know. But this, I can't say a lot about it right now, simply because there's some non-disclosure agreements that are required by Congress to participate in this. But I can say enough to tell you that evaluation is much more limited in what it's allowed to do from a research standpoint than the first two. And that evaluation was set up during the Trump administration. So the trend is away from information. And if you think about it, everything that I've said tonight about information, none of it is super controversial in the research community, the nonpartisan research community. All of it comes from state data. None of this is super fancy math. Like that statistic I just gave you, 8 in 10 kids, it's just what percentage of voucher users did not ever have a public school record before taking that voucher? This is not high level stuff. It's just information, and we can't get it anymore. And this is all by design. And Carol, and some of you all know how hard it is to get information from charter providers, and they're theoretically more public than voucher schools, right?
So that helps to explain why the negative results from these major studies don't make any difference, because the people who are pushing vouchers want them for the 7 or 8 out of 10 kids who already are attending private schools. So they're using the kids who transfer in from public schools as a fig leaf, because I think, for example, of Ohio and Arizona, where there's a major push to expand vouchers, and yet Ohio has clear information that they're actually hurting the kids who transfer in from public schools. Now, do they hurt kids who transfer in, but they don't hurt kids who are already there? How does that work? Or the getting low performing kids and they're worse off by being in a voucher school?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of information about kids who have always been in a private school and never left. There's reasons for that, but our information is tied to public money supporting a child in a particular environment, and that's the case even in some public programs through the public education system. Some of what we know exists because there's federal title money attached to it, so it's not strictly a private sector issue. But I think the other thing here is we've all, I mean, and since COVID, I mean, we've all, I think, done a lot of soul searching, and, you know, very closely linked to the same people who were pushing vouchers in the late 90s and early 2000s, Dan, you know, of course, were also some of the big pushers of the standards and accountability movements in Florida and others, which were all entirely dependent on testing and that sort of thing. And I think, you know, Jay Green wrote this piece that was distributed by the University of Arkansas in 2007. And I saved it. I have it still, because the whole point of this piece, the title of it is "You Can't Choose If You Don't Know." And the argument was that states were avoiding No Child Left Behind's requirements to provide information about choice options by minimizing the amount of information they were reporting about, in Jay's view, public school academic failures. And so what he wanted was to make sure that when a public school performed very poorly, everybody knew about it, because there were provisions put into No Child Left Behind that you know, did require districts to support transfer of kids, either, you know, even within the public sector. And it's actually a really articulate argument for why, if you applied it to voucher schools, it's very strong. It's a great argument for why voucher schools should have to report their information. The problem is it's been entirely disowned at this point. And, you know, that's because of how bad the voucher test scores are. And so you've seen this movement completely away from it. And I think, you know, there have been plenty on the left and among public school advocates too, of course, who have raised strong reservations about academics and things. And I think the right has taken those reservations that teachers, you know, understandably make, and we all have shared, and really built off of those and made it seem almost like a bipartisan effort to minimize. I think where we've landed here is that test scores are used essentially to punish schools and teachers, but not much else is really what I think the right wants them to be used for. I want to make sure the other thing that I should say here is, you know, many of you, I think, understood much earlier than I did. I think there's, Dan, we've talked a bit about the sort of original history of voucher type programs being really rooted in massive resistance to Brown v. Board. And I want to I think it's related to the test score conversation in the following way. You know, there's something of a family reunion going on, I think, right now on the right, with the sort of set of arguments for those 1950s style voucher programs and the type of things being proposed today, where it's becoming increasingly explicit almost by the month that these voucher programs are providing vehicles for parents to move their kids away from LGBTQ children, from children, they don't say from children of color, but they say from wokeism, and from, you know, just before we got on the call, I saw that now Governor Sanders in Arkansas has banned CRT teaching in Arkansas public schools, right? I think that the conversation is moving almost monthly at this point away from providing the best education for your child. That rhetoric is still there, but it's being replaced almost by the month again by values, and then with values comes the really unveiled anti-LGBTQ language, anti-DEI language, anti-woke language. And I think from my perspective, you know, I say this a lot publicly, right? Like, if you didn't know anything about the horrible, unprecedented negative academic outcomes for kids, you didn't know these groups weren't all marching arm in arm with election denier groups, and all you knew was that these schools and these programs were formally excluding children on the basis of gender, sexuality, in some cases race, and special academic needs. That's all you knew. We would still know enough to find these programs to be really awful, and to be a threat, not just to public education, but to human rights. And I think that's where we are at this point. And I wanted to make sure that I, at least for my part, said that, because it's not me as a program evaluator saying that. It's the view that I had a year ago, where I was looking around and trying to find out why we were having conversations about vouchers when we've never seen negative impacts as strong as we've seen for vouchers on anything. I mean, again, Katrina, the COVID pandemic, maybe virtual schools, and 4-day school weeks. Those that you have to talk about knocking a day a week off of education to get as big as what the vouchers have done. Why are we still talking about them? I think it's the social stuff. And I don't know. I just that's the reason I wrote 12 newspaper columns instead of 1, I guess, if that helps.
Well, you know, this has got to be one issue where the evidence is strongly on one side, and yet vouchers seem to be taking off more and more almost every day. I mean, it's big news when the state Supreme Court in Kentucky said that the law that was passed there was unconstitutional, because in more and more states, the state courts have decided that the state constitution doesn't mean anything. I mean, on the one hand, the conservatives say that they're originalists, but on the other, they decide that if the state constitution says that no money shall go to any religious school, directly or indirectly, it actually doesn't mean that. It means it doesn't mean anything. So you just ignore that and say, well, it's going to go to a third party. It's going to go to the parents. We're not actually sending money to schools, we're sending money to parents, and they can take it wherever they want to take it. So that's okay. But the disjunction between what you describe is the convergence of research, saying this is actually harmful. You know, we have that old saying about at least do no harm. This is harmful. And yet state after state either has a voucher program, wants to expand its voucher program, or is, you know, they are envious of states that have them. I mean, Texas being a great example, where every session, and it'll happen again this year, the lieutenant governor and the governor will bring up vouchers again. And we just hope that the legislature draws the line, because the rural communities don't see any reason to have vouchers. But I have to also comment something you said in the beginning about one of the arguments for vouchers is you can't have a school where one size fits all. Well, if there is a definition of one size fits all, it's a voucher school. It's a school where everyone has the same religion, where there are no kids who are LGBT, where there are, the girls all have to wear skirts and they're not allowed to wear pants. I mean, this is really one size fits all education, and you find your group and you will be in it. And this is why we see with the voucher movement a rise in segregation. And it's as though the Brown decision is being quietly repealed. But I want, before we break for the Q&A, I'd like to ask you just to talk a little bit about the population of researchers. This has interested me because while I am not a voucher researcher or program evaluator, I'm a historian, I know a lot of these guys. I've known them for years. And I mean, whether it's Checker Finn and Mike Petrilli at the Fordham Institute, they're very conservative. They want vouchers. So when they funded the Ohio study, the introduction to the Ohio study did not actually say what the study said. It said
Right.
something quite different. And they are now pushing hard for more vouchers in Ohio, despite the failure of vouchers in Ohio. Paul Peterson, Jay Green, this is a kind of a group of people who, as you know, all know each other, and they're not independent. They have a point of view, and they never seem to backtrack on their point of view. Now, part of this, I think, is because so many of these guys were trained, like Patrick Wolf and Jay Green, were trained by Paul Peterson. Yes. Martin West, Paul's PhD graduates are strongly of his view about vouchers and choice in general. But who do we believe? I mean, I know who I believe would, and I would say that anybody funded by Walton or Bradley or any of these other groups has to be viewed with a certain amount of skepticism, because their funders are expecting a pro-voucher, pro-choice outcome.
Yeah, I've wrestled with how to explain or talk about, not necessarily explain, to talk about this network of folks that I'm a part of. Like any network of people, it's surprisingly small. The voucher read, and I wrote a little bit, and I would encourage people to read. We can send around again. I wrote a little bit about this for your page a couple months ago. I've been increasingly using this phrase industry funded research, and I think that's part of it. I haven't talked myself as much in the language of, sort of the corporate pieces of this, because it's just not the area I can speak to, but I can speak to the very insular, intellectually incestuous sort of group of people. And I think it's almost impossible to just to talk about how large and negative those voucher impacts on test scores are. It's almost impossible to sort of really overstate how small and networked this small group of people. There's you all remember probably that game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, the Hollywood actor. It takes one person removed to get back to Paul Peterson. And I don't want to make this all about one person, even whether it's Peterson or Betsy DeVos or whoever, because there's a lot of these folks. But just from the standpoint of where the research comes into this conversation, because it's been used from the very beginning to motivate these programs. And the research really does exist from a tiny group of people. So you've probably all seen, if you're on this call, you've probably read enough sort of conservative talking points to be alarmed and frustrated. And there are numbers that get trotted out. For example, right now, the number that Goldwater and EdChoice and some of these places are 17 studies show this. And it's a little bit, the best analogy I can use is it's a little bit like you might have seen those maps where the red state, blue state maps, where you see a lot of red across the country. And it makes it look like the United States is overwhelmingly red and there's just these little pockets of blue. But then when you make it by population instead of geographic area, the country's very blue. That's sort of how voucher research is too, in the sense that these people's full-time job has been to crank out study after study after study. And the accuracy of these things isn't really the point. It's that you start to flood the zone, or I call it rack up wins. It's about being able to say there are 17 studies, and even if 12 of the 17 aren't any good and 4 of the remaining 5 are questionable and maybe 1 is decent. I mean, statistically speaking, you're always going to find there's a 1 in 5 chance that something is going to seem statistically significant just by chance. That's true. I don't have the energy to go study by study by study with every one of these things, because eventually you're going to find something that statistically is correct just by accident. But those 17 studies all come from the same group and the same people. And that's really, I mean, that's definitionally bad science for those who care. But from a much less sort of arcane standpoint, it's also just there's no quality control, and more than that, it's all there was just a report released yesterday. Some of us have talked about the Heritage Foundation released this report about, I can't even understand half of it, about why rural schools are actually helped by school choice. And there's this number that they're trotting out, 1 in 7 70% of kids are within a mile of a private school or something. I can't even remember, but my point is, this is what we call in the business torturing the data. And if you torture the data long enough, you're going to find something that the data say that fits what you want it to say. And that's what this whole operation of people exists to do. And it's fewer than 20. And it's the same folks. And I have been to so many meetings, and I've been on so many like programs that, you get a left and you get a right and you get a middle. And I've always, my shtick until the last year has been the middle guy. Like, I'm always the one that they put on these committees who's not the heritage person and who's not necessarily like NEA. I'm no one's going to make me in that position anymore from over the last year, but that's been historically my role. And so I know all of these people. I've known Corey DeAngelis, that young man. He's not even 30. I mean, he's a young guy. If you think about who the stars of the conservative political world are right now, it's these young dudes who are like 28, 29 years old, and they're conflict merchants. And that role that these people play, they all come out of that network. If you and some are good researchers and some aren't. I mean, that the particular individual is just a lobbyist. I mean, he's by definition, he works for Betsy DeVos's lobbying group. And some others are, it's not easy to become a named chair at Harvard. But I will say this as somebody who identifies as a white man, like a lot of this comes down to, this is such a failed idea. A lot of this comes down to, I've said this on Jennifer Berkshire's podcast, vouchers is it's the ultimate affirmative action for white male ideas in the business. I mean, it is failure after failure after failure up, and it pays to be in that organization of people. And I would say, even Paul Peterson and his sort of academic children and academic grandchildren now, of whom that Corey DeAngelis person is one, even he isn't much without the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested in this kind of stuff, right? Like, you could scream all you want and write all the books you want that are published by Brookings or Harvard Education Press, but it's getting into the room with governors and legislators and providing them with talking points to write legislation. That's what I think this group has really succeeded in doing in ways that the progressive side is we're just not as well funded. People ask me in Michigan, what's Betsy DeVos going to do now that her voucher program face planted for a 3rd time? And I don't know the answer to that, but we heard tonight, and there's some strong rumors coming out of Michigan, that Tudor Dixon, who just got wrecked by Gretchen Whitmer by 11 points in the governor's race, maybe announcing for senator, Debbie Stabenow stepping down. And I mean, where's that money coming from? She was DeVos's handpicked candidate in the gubernatorial race. when you have unlimited resources, you can push through a lot. And I guess I would just say, just to wrap up that last question, I think that's why this network has thrived. It's an important, as you all know, it's important knowing who to call. And when you have this problem coming out of Texas, and Texas, as you all know, has had a long-standing rural conservative opposition to vouchers, and it has killed multiple attempts at vouchers in the past. Cue the Heritage report coming out of DC, just released yesterday, on time for session beginning this morning. I mean, Texas session began today, like a lot of states. Yesterday, the Heritage rural reports released saying rural choice is great. That none of that is. That's what happens when you know the 20 people to call on your network and say, we need to dial up a study pretty quickly. Here's 80 grand to do it. These studies, that's about what they run, 70 to 80 grand to do something like that. It's expensive. And when you have unlimited resources, it's easy to dial that stuff up and just drop it right in the lap of these folks in the legislatures. It's formidable.
Yeah.
I'm going to
money rules.
Mhm.
I think it's time for us to go to the Q&A. Carol, I'm going to hand that back to you.
Yeah.
Marla.
Before we become so depressed, we just put a cover over our heads and we don't even ask the questions. Thank you, both of you, very much. And by the way, Diane's blog has passed 40.1 million views, I think, during this last hour. So Marla, could you pick a couple of questions here for us to talk about?
Yep. Good evening, everybody. Well, the first question is actually from Carol. Carol writes, there's so many voucher programs that do not demand that students take state tests. Aren't we limited to what we're able to see in our ability to really evaluate the effectiveness then of these voucher programs if they don't make kids take state tests?
Do you want me to take that one, or I mean, yes, we are limited. That said, we've made any number of public policy decisions across the domain of public policy, not just in education, based on substantially less information than we have about voucher programs already. And I mean, can you think of anything that matters to progressive education advocates, whether it's teacher training, professional development, class sizes, pick a conservative target like CRT or something. If anything that was important to us showed in one state pandemic size negative impacts on test scores, it wouldn't exist. We would not be talking. It would have been killed immediately if any of these things important to us, let alone by four different independent teams, by the way, just to Diane's last question to me, like all four of those states that I mentioned were done by different people. So I think it's important to keep them from an accountability standpoint, and because it isn't just data, right? And that's something I had to remind myself on early in my career. I mean, these are children's lives. And the thing that's really awful about all of this is that a lot of these kids are disadvantaged. These are often means tested programs, and they're promising, at least initially they start that way, and they're promising these kids salvation, and in fact they're setting them even further behind. So I don't want to give up on that. I don't want to sort of say, well conservatives are going to write policy that's just not going to allow us to know what's going on in these schools. I think we have to keep asking, but it is getting more and more difficult to do.
Okay, our next question is from Pam Harbin. Pam asked, what about other privatization models like competency-based education combined with the elimination of seat time requirements? She adds a comment, students will take public money with them in their backpack to receive instruction outside of the public school. So again, her question is, what about other privatization models like competency-based education combined with an elimination of seat time requirements?
Wow. I mean, I don't know a lot about those things. There's a quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which is better to stay silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. But I will just say, I'm very skeptical at this point of if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And if we had a magic solution to knowing perfectly how to educate children in this country or elsewhere, we think we would have. It's not easy to do, and people who tell you that it's easy and can do it, you can do it quickly with some new idea. I'm just skeptical of that at this point.
Right. And I think this next question by Carol probably will speak a little bit more to that, not so much with competency based, but Carol wants to know, Josh, can you talk about the use of voucher money being used for homeschooling with ESA?
I thought we were supposed to be more optimistic in the second half of this conversation. ESAs are even more difficult in the sense that as little information is coming out of current voucher programs, even less coming out of ESAs. And I've had a couple of state legislators ask me about that in the last 7 days. And what we know isn't good. And it's that that's where that ATM style model of education comes into the conversation. It's the idea is, ESAs essentially are savings accounts that there's different ways of funding them, but think of it as an ATM for education. Essentially, parents get, it's a little different from a voucher in the sense that it's vouchers and tax credit supporting vouchers tend to go for tuition and tuition related things, and there's some other stuff, but ESA is the idea is you can spend it on a qualified educational expense. That's usually an official term. And if for those of you who know anything about agricultural policy, there's a lot of effort that's made for farmers and community sustained agriculture to get organic labels, because it's actually, once you can get the label organic from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it's big business. And similarly in states, once you get the education service provider label by the state, it's usually the Treasury Department or the Department of Ed, you're all of a sudden an appropriate recipient for that parent's money. So we've seen some stories from reporters coming out of places like Oklahoma and Arizona on just really kind of wild stretches of the imagination to get things called educational expenses, televisions, flat screen TVs, gaming equipment. In Arizona, there's even like gymnasiums, like the corporate gym, like if you have grandchildren or children, and I have a couple little stepkids, these trampoline parks and things, they get education labels, and they cost $20 for an hour of jumping, and you can use your ATM, your educational expense account, at those types of places. And so it's not even just tuition or per pupil expenditures anymore in those environments. It's actually these kinds of really kind of far out type things, and it's predatory lending. I mean, let's be honest, like these accounts are targeted toward low income families, and it's very similar to predatory lending behavior.
All right. Jay Blackman asks, he heard that when Al Shanker was head of the AFT, he supported charter schools, which may have given a credence to voucher programs. Do you have any information concerning this?
I can speak to that. Al Shanker came out in favor of charter schools in 1988. And his idea was that a charter would only be approved if all the teachers in the school agreed that it would be an experimental school within the school, run by a group of teachers who said, we have a great idea, we'd like to try this out. And they would get a charter, and they would have their school within the school with the approval of all the other teachers and with the approval of the school board. And he went around starting in 1988, promoting that idea. And then charters started to open. And I think the one that got his attention, one of the first, was called the Noah Webster Classical Academy. And it was a very, very conservative, non-union charter. And he began to back away. And he had embraced the charter idea in 88. About 5 years later, he denounced charters and said that charters were no different from vouchers, and that the purpose of the charter movement was to smash the unions and destroy public education. So I've often heard charter supporters say, well, Al Shanker had the idea. Well, he was one of, there was another guy at the University of Massachusetts who had it first, but they like to quote Al Shanker because it makes it seem like, wow, it came from a union leader. But they will never, ever admit that he turned against charters and said they're no different from vouchers. And he saw the menace, particularly because the way the first law was written in Minnesota was to say that the charters do not need to be unionized. And that just suddenly caught the attention of the Walton Foundation, all these, the Bradley Foundation, all these right-wing groups who, more than charter schools, wanted to get rid of teachers' unions.
Okay. All right. Diane Shorwitz asked, is there research on outcomes for tax credit scholarship type voucher programs such as they have in her state of Illinois?
Not as such, but I was actually just talking to some folks in Illinois earlier this afternoon about the eventual issue of reauthorizing or extending the program there in your state. And I mean, the voucher literature, the voucher research is directly relevant and is, for all intents and purposes, the same as for tax credits. It's willfully stupid to claim that a tax credit isn't a voucher, as the advocates do. Tax credits are tax expenditures. The way I've put this is, and they go toward, they function as a voucher. So the parent walks with $10,000 or $8,000 or whatever it is, $1,000 to their private school, pays their tuition, whether they got it from a scholarship granting organization funded through a tax credit system or through a direct appropriation from the state legislature on like a classic voucher scheme. It's essentially the same thing. And so what I've told folks who have asked similar questions is don't believe the really, it's a lie that there are different types of programs. It's I was talking to some folks in Kentucky about this. My first teaching job as a professor was at University of Kentucky, and whether your boss withholds $100 from your paycheck on a Friday afternoon, or you stop at the horse track and gamble $100 away, you're coming home $100 poorer to feed your family. And that's the only difference between vouchers and tax credits. You're still walking away with $100 poorer. It's just one is withholding and one is you actually gambling it away. So
I think it's important also to recognize that states come up with these different names, first of all, to try to avoid their state constitution, which they usually do. And the other reason is because the word school vouchers is very unpopular.
incredibly unpopular.
I have looked at the referenda, and I think there's never actually been a referendum that has said we want vouchers. Voucher referenda usually go down by 65 to 70%. I mean, it's not even close. So they prefer, when they're pushing vouchers, to call them tax credits, educational scholarships. They'll have it come up with a creative name of that kind, but because people say, oh, scholarship, that sounds okay. Voucher, no.
It's a really good point. And in fact, seems like a lifetime ago, but last spring when I first started really working in with sort of the grassroots folks in Michigan, the most daily kind of harassment I got kind of from the conservative social media types was on this issue of just whether to call it DeVos vouchers or not. And they just, I mean, I couldn't believe how angry it got the right when I called these vouchers, like to the point where I was confused almost. I mean, I understood that it's politically unpopular, but it's like, you guys, I mean, most of the time they don't tell like a willful lie. And in this case, it's just, they wanted it to be called, every one of these places is called a scholarship program or, the tax credit. The legal reason is exactly as Diane says, it's to avoid constitutional problems. Some states have blessed tax credit programs because there's not a direct pass through. But the insight that the Kentucky Supreme Court had, and it was based on a specific item in Kentucky's constitution, but they basically said from the beginning, if you withhold money from the government, it has the same mathematical effect as the government spending money, and that's all it is. And the way to think about tax credits too for folks, I mean, most of us don't. Most folks are not wealthy enough to really make a lot of use of tax credits, and when we file our taxes, sometimes child tax credits, sometimes you might get a tax credit for a certain type of employment, but mostly this is something that's done for the wealthy. And the way that a tax credit system works in a place like Michigan, or in Kentucky's case, what the court rejected, and in Illinois and other places, is what an individual, usually a very wealthy individual, owes to the state in their state income taxes instead gets put into a voucher fund. That's all that it does. So instead of me paying Betsy DeVos paying $50 million in state income taxes to the state of Michigan, she holds it and moves it into a scholarship granting organization. That's the official term for these things, but they're voucher funds. And so you don't have to be a tax accountant or sort of a tax genius to understand that, you know, whether Betsy DeVos gives the state of Michigan 50 million or she takes her 50 million and moves it into a voucher fund, it's still $50 million that the state can't put, you know, to fund clean air or public schools or, you know, childcare or something like that. So it has the net effect. And lawyers have spent, I'm not a lawyer, lawyers have spent a lot of ink arguing about the difference between these two things, but mathematically they're the same.
Okay. So staying with Diane in Illinois, and then piggybacking off Diane is Cassie Creswell, who's also a grassroots organizer in Illinois. A lot of this is about getting access to data. So Cassie's seconding sort of off Diane's question. Would the state of Illinois already have data on whether students in voucher programs here in Illinois were ever enrolled in public schools, if grassroots organizers, researchers, or journalists could wrench it out of them?
Yes. I mean, they should. Without reading up fully yet on the exact mechanism of that system. I mean, maybe at some point in the next few months, I'll sort of just write a brief about what data are available, what data should be available, and because there are certain data that are available in every state, and that's for there are federal reasons for that. How available it is, who has access to it, and even within agencies, it's difficult. So usually what happens with in these cases, and this is why it's hard to get information, is some of these agencies don't talk to each other, or they're not very good. They're very siloed. And that's actually mostly the case in the Midwest, actually, where we have big state governments. And so here, for example, in Michigan, it's very similar to Illinois, very similar setup. A lot of information about our lowest income kids is actually contained in our health and human services agencies. So I'll give an example of homeless children. There's federal homeless student money and regulation that involves taking care of these children. And then there's several companion laws that are done through the healthcare agencies. It's enormously difficult to get the health and human services agencies and the departments of education within states to talk to each other. They have longstanding cultural barriers to doing it. And they're great civil servants, but they're all skeptical of each other. And that's just by design and by culture. So that's one thing. Usually if you were an enterprising journalist or public advocate, it's not just FOIAing one agency, you have to get information on two at least. And the reason it's relevant to this conversation is, especially for tax credit states like Illinois, that's all run through their departments of treasury. And so you were talking about bringing yet another agency in. And for the most part, departments of treasury don't have the same experience or cultural inclination sharing data, because it's taxpayer data, that departments of education do. There is more of a tradition of research, and a lot of federal money is tied to compliance and accountability, which implies at least some degree of data sharing, right? We can all look up our local public schools' academic performance online because that's federal law. There isn't really a companion version of that when it comes to tax credits and tax codes. And that's why it's harder and harder to get this information. It's not impossible. It exists. It's being held at state agencies, but it's often you have to pull it together.
Okay.
Florida, one last sort of aside, Florida has sort of been a pioneer at linking this stuff pre-DeSantis, but not anymore.
Okay, well, we're going to move to the state of Texas now. Reverend Mary Spradlin is giving a comment, and then she has a question. She says, vouchers seem very poised to get a lot of attention from the Texas legislature this year, but you won't see the word voucher. It's always parent choice. So her question is, do you feel that the word voucher has a sufficiently negative connotation for people who aren't versed in this debate to make an impression that parent choice is code for really something they don't want?
I think that you had started to talk a little bit about that, Diane.
Well, yeah, the basic thing is that if you, no matter what term they use, just keep saying vouchers, and that vouchers take money away from public schools. They defund public schools. And they would like to, the public to believe that the money somehow has a separate stream, and it doesn't have a separate stream. It's all out of one pot. I mean, in effect, we're cutting the pie three ways, one way for public schools, one way for charter schools, and a third way for voucher schools. And that means that the great majority of children who are in public schools are going to get less funding than the kids who go out of the public system. But I think it's very important to keep saying voucher, 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 because there's never been a voucher referendum that's passed, and politicians will do anything possible to avoid a referendum. They tried to buy off the referendum in Arizona, and they failed. That this was Koch funding the pro-voucher position, obviously, and they kept trying to knock it off the ballot, and it did get on the ballot. The anti-voucher people won with 65% of the vote, and then the legislature came back the next year and expanded the voucher program anyway.
Okay, just a quick fact from Diane House. She's from AFT New Hampshire. She didn't ask a question, but Darcy and I thought this was interesting. In New Hampshire, she writes, the biggest recipient of ESA money one quarter last year was Amazon. FYI. Okay, Susan asked a question, and then we've got, it looks like one more question we're going to combine about what happens when voucher students get kicked out of private schools. So this quick question for you guys is from Susan. Susan asked, should we abandon research in our advocacy efforts and depend instead on values?
Short answer, I think no. Longer answer, I can say for my own part, speaking only for me, I mean, it's getting exhausting, and I've only been doing this for a year. And some of you have been doing this. Diane's been talking about this publicly for 20 years. I've been overwhelmed by the negative energy that exists, like people who it seems like all they do, they don't actually have children to raise, or spouses to go home to, or churches to attend. All they do is hit you and slap you online, and it can get difficult. And I said before, I mean, I like at this point, I can't go through study after study after study. I mean, a lot of people send me things these days asking me to debunk this or that, and I try to help out, but you know, not everything that ever gets published is necessarily factually wrong. As I've mentioned, you can torture the data to tell you almost anything you want. I think what I've tried to do for my own limited part is stick with fairly simple things, like how terrible vouchers are for test scores. Where did these kids using vouchers come from? These are not overly complicated things. I do think we always need to talk, at least in terms of evidence and facts and research, whether we're talking about how bad vouchers are for kids, or whether we're talking about, you know, the use of vaccines, or whether we're talking about global warming. I mean, there's just certain things that we wouldn't know without research, and one of them is that vouchers harm children. But I will say, for my part, you know, at the end of the day, at some point, and Diane would be able to speak more toward when it occurred, when I said that there's been this kind of family reunion back with the kind of language and the types of folks organizing around Brown versus Board of Education in today's exclusionary work to get voucher systems. I look at this whole thing, and it is walking pretty quickly away from the evidence, at least on that side, and it's turning more and more, in my view, toward a war on vulnerable children. And you know, we know the headline grabbing issues like LGBTQ and children of color, and not just LGBTQ kids, but their families. I mean, we've heard reports out of Florida, for example, of kids being expelled from private schools, taking voucher money because their parents are gay. You know, I mean, it gets overwhelming to think in those terms too, of how this sort of negativity out there. And I mean, I don't mean that in like a Pollyanna-ish kind of way, but just like the absolute darkness in some sense of all of this. But you know, the research is on our side.
So don't abandon it.
I think the morals are on our side, but it takes a lot of work. And you know, and I think it's not about abandoning the research, but it's thinking about it's using it smartly and asking the right questions, I think, is important. And at this point, I'm convinced. I mean, I really am convinced that these programs are so bad, we have such consistent, reliable, and neutral evidence against them, that we don't necessarily need to spend $4 million in 5 years like Bradley did in Milwaukee to fund that study. We don't need to necessarily do that. We just need some basic information at some point, like 70% of kids used a voucher who were already in private schools. I mean, I think that that's really, really powerful stuff. And it doesn't even necessarily take research. And the last thing I'll say, and before I shut up on this, is I know there are a couple of, or at least there were earlier, a couple of journalists on the call. I've been really privileged to spend a lot of time talking to both political journalists and education journalists, mostly in Michigan, but elsewhere as well, increasingly elsewhere. And I've talked to a couple of young reporters who are, you know, kind of 3-4 years into the business, and you know, they've shared that, like, they can't write a story about vouchers without DeVos people calling them up and screaming at them and yelling at them to retract something or to change it. And then if they don't do it, then they call their editor and they do it. I mean, that it's not just social media, it's just constant. But I've relied on a lot of the stuff about Bradley, the LGBTQ stuff that didn't come from academic researchers, that came from journalists like at Chalkbeat. So it isn't just public school advocates in advocacy groups and stakeholder groups. It isn't just academic researchers like me. It's not just historians like Diane. This also includes entrepreneuring journalists, and we need to kind of protect that group as well. And like all of the, like the research has been sort of polluted a little bit by some of these think tanks. Of course, there are these right-wing journalism organizations. I mean, the editor of the opinion page of the Detroit News is the former ALEC comms director. She moved from ALEC to the Detroit News editorial page and writes talking points for Betsy DeVos now from that perch. So not everybody's neutral there, but we have learned a lot from good, solid reporting on voucher programs too, not just research. And I want to make sure that we're paying attention to that too.
I want to add, and probably we should wind this up, but I want to just make this point, that there's an old saying in the law that I've heard, that when the facts are on your side, you pound the facts. When the law is on your side, you pound the law. And when you have neither the facts nor the law, you pound the table. And I think that what the voucher people have done is they have so much money. They are, you know, financed by billionaires. And there's nobody in the public school sector who has that kind of funding. And mostly it's just grassroots groups of parents and citizens who care about their public schools. They don't have money. They don't open on the first day as some of the Moms for Liberty chapters do with $1 million or $2 million. So I think that it's important to say the facts and the research are on the side of public schools. The values are on the side of public schools. The public schools are places where kids from different backgrounds come together and learn to live with other people, learn to work together with kids and families who are different from themselves. It's really kind of a starting place for democracy. And school boards have been, I can't remember his name, but one of the books that I read recently was about how school boards are frequently a jumping off place for getting into politics. And it's very important, particularly for minority families, to have that starting place on the local school board where you can then go into run for Congress or the city council. But on the values side, there are two books I could recommend, and I'm not sure I can remember the names of the books, but I can remember the names of the authors because I reviewed them both. One is Derek Black's book. Do you know, Carol, do you remember the name of Derek's book? Derek is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina.
Schoolhouse Burning?
Schoolhouse Burning. Schoolhouse Burning, he goes through the history of American education as seen by a lawyer to show how the resistance to public education came from people who wanted segregation, who did not want to see publicly funded schools, period. And there has always been this constituency of very wealthy people who didn't want to pay taxes for public schools. Then there's a book by Steve Suits, S-U-I-T-T-S, and again, I'm having trouble remembering the name of it, but it has to do with the history of segregation. And Steve Suits is at, I think, the Southern Education Foundation. And he just lays it all out, that if you look at the reaction to the Brown decision, it is overwhelmingly an effort to create vouchers and what we would today call charter schools, private academies with public funding, where kids could escape from being in integrated schools. I mean, this is the history of the school choice movement. And because I'm older probably than everybody on this call, I can remember a long period of time where literally the term school choice was avoided because school choice meant segregation. And there were no advocates for school choice in the 70s and 80s, and not until the early 90s did school choice shed its ugly reputation of being, I want segregated schools because I don't want to go to school with those, I don't want my kids in school with those children. And that is the history. I wrote about it in the New York Review of Books. Nancy McLean, who wrote a terrific book called Democracy in Chains, has also written about the segregationist history of the charter school movement and the voucher movement. So bear in mind, the facts are on our side, the values are on our side, and it's these billionaires who are swooping in with the help of ALEC, and ALEC has a state-by-state strategy, which is described in Gordon Lafer's book called The 1% Solution. They go state by state, picking off the states for vouchers, for charters, for removing any standards for teachers. And this is not good for the future. This is not good for kids. It's not good for education. And it's certainly not good for American society, because it means we'll have people without qualifications and voucher schools, without certification, without subject matter knowledge, teaching the next generation at a time when we should have better qualified teachers. So that's my spiel for the day. And I want to thank you all for being with us. It's been a great conversation. I especially want to thank Josh Cowen for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. And it's so important to people like us who've been fighting this battle to know that one of the really knowledgeable experts in the voucher area is coming out of the bull gate, ready to ride and not afraid. Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you all.
Thank you, and good night, everyone. And want to make sure that you know that we just put out a new report on for-profit charter schools. Be sure to read it. And next report's going to be a sharp turn right about the rise of right-wing conservative charter schools. All of this, my friends, is tied, all of it's tied together. Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night. And this recording will be up within a day or two, both on our website and on our YouTube channel.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye
Thanks a
now.
lot, Josh.